You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and federally certified veteran-owned small business. I'm your host, Robert Bain, along with our producer, Chris Spangle. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact us at chris@leadersandlegends.net. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, Bennett Parten. He's a member of the new generation of Civil War historians. Thank God there is a new generation of Civil War historians, not only because of a fresh perspective, because we want to keep this struggle in the frontal lobe of not only our study of history, but of our study of America and Americans. Dr. Parten is an assistant professor of history at Georgia Southern University. He is a native of Royston, Georgia, which I've never heard of. You have to tell me the good places to eat in Royston, Georgia. I'm sure it's full of them. Completed his PhD in history at Yale University. His writing has appeared in the Washington Post, Los Angeles Review of Books, and the Civil War Monitor. He lives in Savannah, which I also hope he thinks is too pretty to burn. Along with his friend William Tecumseh Sherman, we are discussing his book, Somewhere Toward Freedom, Sherman's March and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation. Dr. Parten, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
William Tecumseh Sherman, Sherman's March to the Sea, Emancipation, the 13th Amendment, the list goes on and on. You could make the argument that from September 1864, which is when Atlanta fell, or was captured by Sherman and his army, through April of 65, the assassination of Lincoln on April 14th, is the most interesting and the biggest watershed, seminal part of the Civil War. How wrong would I be? And how much does this march and how it dealt with emancipation, the freed slaves, either buttress my assertion or refute it?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, so much is happening. That's happening on the battlefield. Like you said, Atlanta falls. This is a major strategic victory in the West. And as Atlanta is falling, Lee is pinned down at Petersburg in Virginia, which of course will be the next phase of that will be surrender at Appomattox. So things are certainly happening on the battlefield, but even in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere, there are real conversations about what's going to come next, right? Much of the 13th Amendment, as you said, is being debated and hashed out over the course of the fall of 1864 before being officially passed in late January. And then, of course, that doesn't even begin to talk about the official ending of the war in April, which happens to coincide right with Lincoln's death. So this is certainly a busy, important time in American history. And you're absolutely right. Sherman's March is a part of that. And one of the arguments that I have wanted to make about Sherman's March is that its social and political implications are just as important as its military implications. We tend to remember the march as being this seminal moment that led to the defeat of the Confederacy. We remember the burning of Atlanta, which happens before Sherman embarks on this march. And certainly I can say as a Georgian, the popular memory of the march in Georgia is one of destruction. You know, the grievances of white Southerners have been stoked by Sherman's march for a generation or more now. But what's important to recognize, too, I think, is this march was also a liberation event for enslaved people. It was an emancipation event and the largest in American history. And so because of this, and because of the size of the refugee movement of enslaved people that followed the army to Savannah, Sherman's March is going to set the stage for what's going to come next in Reconstruction. And in some ways, I think you can see Sherman's March as being a kind of early battle in the early phase of Reconstruction and as essentially setting the table for the kind of questions that are going to have to be answered in early 1865 and over the course of the summer of 1865 as we transition from the Civil War to the post-war period. So I think your assertion is absolutely correct. And I think the march plays a really important role in that story.
There are two historical events, let's say in the last couple hundred years, about which and I'll just be candid, I cannot bring myself to read about, and it's my failing. One of them is the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
I just can't bring myself to dig deep into it, even though I need to before my time ends. And the other is Reconstruction. It is, to me, as much of a tragedy as the Civil War itself, as the battles itself. How much did what happened on Sherman's March, what you detail, mirrors what happens in Reconstruction, or let's say the 4-year period where Andrew Johnson is president in between Lincoln and Grant?
Yeah, well, I mean, it certainly mirrors it in the sense that Reconstruction ends as a promise unfulfilled. It ends with real ambiguity as to whether or not it was a success or a failure. And Sherman's March has a similar ending. It ends really with a moment of ambiguity, and we can kind of question, right, if it created a real opportunity, was it also an opportunity missed? Because the fact is, Sherman's March is going to set in motion a real mass of humanity marching to Savannah. That's going to include refugee enslaved people. It's going to set the table for a real redefinition of freedom to take place in America immediately after the Civil War. But one of the things that happens is that promise is going to be narrowed in scope and whittled away over the course of 1865, as you said, through the Johnson era. So the immediate aftermath of Sherman's March, its long history on the coast of Georgia and South Carolina, really, I think, mirrors the kind of problems and also the ending of Reconstruction on a much more broader national scale. But we can also see Sherman's March as having direct influence over Reconstruction, in part because it is because of this refugee movement, because of the march, that we get an effort at widespread land reform, that is, appropriating plantation land, handing it over to formerly enslaved people. That is attempted on the coast of Georgia and South Carolina in the aftermath of Sherman's March. Because it's attempted there, it suddenly becomes part of a wider more national Reconstruction, or agenda for Reconstruction, I should say. In some ways, too, you can trace the history of the Freedmen's Bureau, which is the central agency that is going to oversee the transition from slavery to freedom, built by the federal government. Its origins lie in the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which is a different story, but its origins relate to Sherman's March in the sense that its first and only commissioner, a man named Oliver Otis Howard, is going to be a member of he's going to lead Sherman's right wing, and will visit the communities around Port Royal, South Carolina, which for him will become a kind of model for what Reconstruction can look like and what a model for the Freedmen's Bureau can look like. And so in so many ways, we can see that Sherman's March and its aftermath and the need to kind of deal with the political and social implications of it, as I said, set the stage for Reconstruction and have real bearing for the shape of Reconstruction when we think about an organization like the Freedmen's Bureau, and also its goals and ambitions when we think about something like land reform.
Just to change the subject for 5 seconds, who is the worst? Which president is worse? Since you're a scholar of the period, Buchanan or Johnson?
I think Johnson, unquestionably. His actions or inactions had, I think, real tragic results. I mean, you can make a similar argument for Buchanan, but I think Johnson was I think definitely worse.
I agree with that. And when everyone talks about the worst presidents, and I'm like, if you don't start the conversation with Andrew Johnson or James Buchanan, then I can't finish this conversation.
Well, it's one thing to be inept, right? Or at least not interested. It's another thing to be inept and also obtuse and antagonistic.
Yes, all the above. And one of my favorite stories of the post-Civil War era is when Andrew Johnson wanted to arrest Robert E. Lee, and Grant said, "If you attempt it, I'll resign my commission." And Johnson realized he wasn't jacking around with some half-drunk, you know, governor somewhere. Shows you the
Yeah.
integrity of Grant and the lack thereof of Andrew Johnson. Obviously, the Civil War gets studied, gets written about quite a bit. There are endless topics, whether it's political or diplomatic, military, social. You've chosen a very famous event, yet have put your own interpretation into play. A, why did you do so? And B, how difficult was it for you to find a new way to write about something that has been plowed quite frequently?
Yeah. Well, maybe I can answer both those questions just by saying a little bit about how the book began. And as I've told folks, it has both a long story and a short story. And the long story, excuse me, is that I was born and raised in Royston, Georgia, which is just north of Athens, Georgia. It's in the northeastern part of the state. It's the home of Ty Cobb for any baseball fans. And every year, my parents would drive down to Hilton Head, which is in South Carolina, Fripp Island, which is in South Carolina, Jekyll Island, Georgia, Savannah, to the coast, essentially, to vacation and visit and everything like that. And for all of the first 30 minutes of that drive, you were essentially on the path of Sherman's March. And then when we got down to the coast, as much as I enjoyed sitting on the beach and playing golf, with my brother, my family, and everything, what I really enjoyed doing was driving around and exploring the low country. And so there's always a part of me that really wanted to write a history of two places that mean so much to me, the low country and also just my home state in general. So I do feel like a real connection to this story. But then the short answer of where this book began has to do with me reading a work of fiction. Some of your readers may be familiar with E.L. Doctorow and his fictional account of Sherman's March called The March. And in his fictional account, he has a character by the name of Wilma Jones, who's a freedwoman who drops everything, runs to Sherman's army, follows the army, and then arrives with the army in Savannah. And I think I immediately knew as a Georgian, as a history student, that Jones was probably a composite character. There were many hundreds and or if not thousands of folks just like Wilma Jones. And so the book really began with me trying to figure out how we could tell the story of Wilma Jones and folks like her from a historical perspective rather than a historical fiction perspective, or rather than as a matter of historical fiction. In some ways, I always saw my mission as writing a kind of nonfiction handbook to E.L. Doctorow's fictional story in the March. That was my mission. That was my entry into this story. And as you said, it was quite difficult, I think, in some respects, because our narrative of what the march was has been locked in place for quite a long time. And it's been locked in place in part because historians have always argued about whether or not Sherman's march represented the birth of total war, meaning that Sherman's tactics in Georgia prefigure what would come later in Europe in the First and Second World Wars, Vietnam, some of these other more modern conflicts. And this debate amongst historians also reinforced the popular memory of the march in the South, that it revolves around white grievances, right? Of what Sherman did to us, Sherman burning Atlanta, him razing the farms and fields of Georgia. That is a narrative that's overstated, but nonetheless, these two, this debate and this popular narrative, I think really had a hold on Sherman's march in a way that always left us imagining it as a military event. But the reality is that when you put the perspective on someone like Wilma Jones, it becomes clear this was much more than a military event for enslaved people, that it was a liberation event. And when you think that about the numbers, you realize just how large of a liberation event this actually was. What I mean by that is that Sherman will write from Savannah that by the time his army arrives in the city, there are about 20,000 freed refugees following his army. 20,000 people who had left plantations, run to the army, followed the army to Savannah, 20,000 Wilma Joneses. And just for perspective, the city of Savannah itself in 1860 only had a population of 22,000. And it was Georgia's largest city. Atlanta only had a population of 10,000. This is a movement of people that run to the army and then follow the army as refugees. This is the size of a large southern city. And so I think just the numbers alone speak to just how big of a movement this was. and how enslaved people perceive this as a true emancipation event, a true liberation event.
When does Sherman leave Atlanta?
He leaves Atlanta in mid-November of 1864.
And he arrives in Savannah on
December 22nd.
yay 1864. And in
That's
that
right.
time period, while Sherman's marching, and this is always kind of the irony of it, and correct me if I'm wrong, the campaign isn't a military campaign as we would ordinarily envision one. It's not the Peninsula campaign of McClellan. It's not the Overland campaign of Grant, where there's all these battles and all this. The march itself, what was Sherman's strategic military goal? Because tactically it didn't have a lot of activity, and please correct me, but as far as I remember, it didn't. But strategically, it was such a big deal. And how did Sherman's strategic military goal get co-opted by the ex-slaves strategic personal goal of freedom?
Yeah, sure. Well, Sherman's long view goal is to leave out of Atlanta, march to Savannah, and then angle his way up to the Carolinas and eventually reunite with Grant in Virginia. And hopefully this can be a kind of pincer movement that would, really put the pressure on the last Confederate armies in the field. But he also has another strategic ambition in that to leave Atlanta, he has to cut loose from his base of supplies. And in doing so, he orders his men to forage off the farms and fields of Georgia, both to sustain themselves. But for Sherman, this is also an attempt to target the emotional and material wherewithal of Southerners to really keep up the fight. It's a kind of emotional, psychological warfare, and also why some historians have seen this as kind of a birth of total war, or at least a preview of the idea of total war. It was never as stringent as I think our memory has us remember it sometimes. Nonetheless, that was Sherman's ambition. It's one of the reasons that the march is so unique. It's also unique in the sense that there's very little resistance, right? There's very few battles. There's one battle at a place called Griswoldville, but it's hardly a battle as we think of it. I think only 1,500 troops might have been engaged, only one of Sherman's divisions. Georgia can really only muster some pretty sad militia regiments. And then there's also a band of Roman cavalry, and that roaming cavalry. And that's really about it. So there's not a whole lot of resistance to speak of. But nonetheless, when Sherman's foragers begin arriving on the plantations, they recognize that enslaved people are there. And they begin to recognize that enslaved people have a real part to play in this campaign. And they have a part to play in the sense that they are there allying with the soldiers. They provide intelligence, they act as guides, as scouts. And then maybe the best story of all is that in advance of Sherman's army, many white families buried their goods or hid their livestock. But of course, they didn't do it themselves. They forced enslaved people to do it for them, which armed enslaved people with real knowledge for where these things were. And they were always quite willing to help the foragers do the foraging by pointing to where the corrals were in the woods or where in the family cemetery some valuables had been hidden. And so enslaved people were incredibly present and acted as the soldiers' allies at every moment of the march. But it does become clear by about Milledgeville, which is one of the halfway points of the march, that enslaved people are also fleeing to the army and making the decision to follow the army as refugees. And so by the halfway point, there is beginning to form a large column, a large group of refugees who are marching on foot. Some are riding on horses, some are riding in carriages, moving along at the rear of Sherman's columns. And pretty soon it'll become clear to the army that they alone are not the authors of this campaign. Have to share ownership of this campaign with enslaved people who are imagining it as a liberation event and who are seizing their own freedom by running and fleeing to the army and by interpreting it, right, as a moment for pursuing their own freedom.
A lot has been written in the last generation or so about a new interpretation of emancipation and that is famously by Barbara Fields in Ken Burns' Civil War, that the slaves freed themselves. That this notion of the benevolent white man, whether it's a Union soldier or Abraham Lincoln or whomever, manifesting this freedom for slaves is outdated. I don't necessarily want you to weigh into the controversy, but as I was reading your book, I kept thinking of, is this an example of what Professor Fields meant? Obviously, they weren't free until the Union Army came through, but they still had to make a positive decision: stay or go.
Yeah, absolutely. They had to make this decision. Many hundreds, thousands of them did make this decision. And you can see actively that as the campaign creates this opportunity, they seize the opportunity to pursue their own freedom. And so, in that sense, we can see this as an effort to self emancipate, to emancipate themselves. But I think you could even carry their involvement in this campaign even further. I mean, as I said, they allied with the soldiers, and there are many different ways in which you can see them as being central to the campaign's success. In that ways, I think you can see them as being kind of agents of the war, right, and of the army in a sense. I mean, outside of Savannah, when the army arrives in the rice swamps, there are a few hairy days where the army's worried that they may actually run out of food, that they may stall out in front of Savannah. But the army is sustained because Sherman's army of Midwesterners, who maybe they've eaten rice before, but they certainly don't know how to cook it or prepare it, are sustained because enslaved people show them how to use a mortar and pestle, show them how to prepare and cook rice. And another better example is that many enslaved men who arrive at the army, some will be coerced into serving, but some will voluntarily serve as army pioneers, which is a term for military laborers.
Mm-hmm.
And in the March, if you were a pioneer, you were a road builder, which leaves us with the image that all throughout Georgia, there are scores of freed people who are literally out in front of the army, paving the way to Savannah for Sherman and his soldiers, which again speaks to just how central enslaved people were to the overall operations of the army and how central they were in helping the army succeed. And so, yes, we can see them running the army as an act of self-emancipation, but we can also just see their involvement in this march in a much sort of bigger scale and see them involving themselves in a variety of different ways. Now, that being said, as they are trying to self-emancipate, we have to recognize, right, the importance of the army itself. I mean, the army is in part legitimizing this experience by enacting a real monopoly of violence in the area. And so, in some ways, we can see this process of emancipation playing out as enslaved people reacting to the army, and then the army also reacting to enslaved people. And we can see it as being a kind of interplay between enslaved people acting on the ground and the power that the U.S. Army had, both real physical power, but also symbolic power that symbolizes, right, the authority of the U.S. state. And so we can see emancipation unfolding as this back and forth and as this interplay between the two sides.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends. Our guest today is Professor Bennett Parten. He teaches history at Georgia Southern University. We are discussing his book, Somewhere Toward Freedom: Sherman's March and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation. I'll say something and you correct me, or you just agree or say, man, that's not even close vein.
All right.
The most sympathetic group of people during the Civil War to me are the slaves and the freed slaves. The least sympathetic group of people during the Civil War are the slave owners, the plantation owners, the gentry class of the South. It wasn't the focus of your book, but how did the O'Haras from Tara handle this march, this event, this socioeconomic upheaval?
Yeah, that's a great question. The reality is that they handle it in different ways. Some families, I think, accepted defeat by this point, knew that they were entering into a new world, that the America, the South that they would inhabit after the war would be fundamentally changed. Others, I think, went with their fists clenched and their teeth clenched, right? And they tried to hold on to whatever vestiges of the antebellum order that they could. And so it really, there's a range of different reactions to this on the part of white Southerners. But one of the things that's kind of interesting about Sherman's march is that many of the plantations that they are encountering have generally been deserted. In the advance of Sherman's army, many of the male plantation owners have all fled. Many of them flee because they're worried about retribution from Sherman's army. They're worried about capture. Many of them may have reason to be fearful because of their involvement with the Confederacy, which means that a lot of the plantations have pretty well been deserted. Maybe there's an overseer. Maybe that there is the plantation mistress, right? Some children. But on the whole, Sherman's army is encountering plantations that are in various states, order, disorder, and are inhabited by different groups of people, right? Like I said, I mean, in many cases, the plantation owner himself has already fled. And so it really was a range of different environments and a range of different reactions.
Going through your book, your research is without a doubt thorough and meticulous. As I was reading it, I struggled to put myself in anyone's shoes. White plantation owners, slaves, freed slaves, the soldiers. As an author, as a scholar of this time period, is that something that you try to achieve as a writer?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily, go so far as trying to embody or put myself in any certain shoes, but you certainly read the source materials, you read the text, you read the archival information that we have, and you try to glean exactly what's going on. You try to understand motive, ambition, perspective, right? And so yeah, so you use all the tools available to try to really get at the core of what's happening and to really try to penetrate the reality that these various individuals are facing to understand why they're making the decisions that they are. And in part, you have to do that, but you have to realize what's at stake, right? That only when you can do that can you really begin to understand the full stakes of the history that you're trying to tell. And so you certainly do that to some extent when it comes to writing a book like this.
But based on that, I'm going to ask you to still try to put us in or explain the mindset, the mentality of, let's just say, a 50-year-old black man or woman, been a slave their entire life, and now they're off the plantation, marching somewhere toward freedom with this group of Northerners who it's not like the Southerners and Northerners didn't exactly hang out a lot, back in the 1850s and early 60s. So just encountering men like that would have been somewhat different. How do you attempt to capture what's going through the minds of someone who is off the plantation, off chains for the first time in their entire life?
Well, we don't have to really work that hard to imagine, in part because they told us, right? The sources oftentimes speak for themselves. And the reality is that when many of the soldiers met enslaved people like that, they had conversations with them, and enslaved people often revealed their own thinking. And even if they didn't make the march, oftentimes they would explain to the soldiers why they wish they could or wanted to, but why they had to stay behind. And this reveals a real web of considerations that enslaved people had to make. So this is kind of the work that historians do when it comes to using sources and really, as I said, trying to glean the different perspectives. But enslaved people were clear, and they told the soldiers oftentimes that they had to worry about family. They had to worry about their own physical condition. I mean, this was a march that was going to be done physically. It was going to be done in the elements. It would last, well, we know it lasted a month and a half, but at the time there was no end destination. Who knew how long it would take, right? So there had to be some sort of assessment of one's physical ability to make this march. As I said, there's a consideration of family. Is leaving with the army going to mean splitting up from loved ones, from a sense of community? Did one have a horse or a buggy or access to food to maybe make this journey easier? And then, moreover, there's a calculation that has to be made of what can be gained and what can be lost, right? Is trekking out with the army to some ill-defined place of freedom a risk that's worth taking over what could be gained by staying in place, staying amongst community, and seeing how the political dynamics of the post-war period plays out, right? These are all really heady calculations that enslaved people have to make. And for every person or every 20,000, right, who every one of the 20,000, I should say, who make the decision to march with the army and arrives in Savannah, there are many others who make different calculations and decide to stay. Or they follow the army and they decide to turn back somewhere along the way, which is something that we know also happened. And so it's really a complicated moment where people are making some really heady and profound decisions about their lives and about the future that they might enter into.
Your book starts out with kind of one of those stories about family. Please tell the Leaders and Legends podcast audience the story to which I'm referring.
Yeah, so it's a story about an enslaved couple. They are both enslaved outside of Atlanta. They arrive at the army when the city falls, and they both find work for the army. The wife becomes a laundress and a cook. The husband becomes a wagon driver for the army. And when Sherman's army pulls out of Atlanta, they both decide to go along, in part because they had a long lost daughter who had been sold away. And the only piece of information they had as to where she might be was that they believed she had been sold to what they called the lower country, meaning the low country, right? And it's not clear, but we can infer that the reason that they decided to go with the army is in part for a chance reunion with their daughter. And we know that this was on their minds because we know the mother, the wife, consistently asked the soldiers, consistently asked other refugees if they had any information about their daughter, if they knew of anyone that might have looked like her. This was recorded by one of the soldiers. And he even says, the soldier that is, that this became known amongst everyone in camp, that this is what the freed woman was hoping to achieve in taking part in the march and in asking the soldiers and the refugees all these questions. And she actually reunites with her daughter at some point through word of mouth. She's told that there's someone here that fits the description, that has the same name, and they meet each other and they have this emotional reunion right there in the middle of Georgia, in the middle of Sherman's march.
Is there a sense that any of the slaves, ex-slaves, refugees had any knowledge of the Emancipation Proclamation, which went into effect on January 1st, 1863?
Yeah, they absolutely did. One of the things that the soldiers became aware of was the fact that enslaved people had their own networks of communication that, quite frankly, stunned the soldiers. There are sources in which soldiers suggest that enslaved people have some sort of underground telegraph wire that alerts them of information before they even know about things happening in DC and beyond. And there's been phenomenal writing by historians about how enslaved people were able to glean this information. And a lot of it comes from, whispering from one person to the next, sharing news from one plantation to the next, someone being literate and reading newspapers, overhearing conversations, right, from masters. There's a lot of historical writing about how effective these networks of communication can be. But what this means is it meant that enslaved people were quite aware of the politics swirling around them and the state of the war and what was going on. And so they were certainly aware of the Emancipation Proclamation. And in fact, I think one of the reasons that the march becomes the phenomenon that it does in terms of enslaved people fleeing to the army is that it happens in 1864 in a place like Georgia, which had a large population of enslaved people. And it's after the Emancipation Proclamation, which gives enslaved people in Georgia a real signal that if they can get to the army, they can find freedom. And that this army and this campaign is truly an army of liberation and a march of liberation. So it gives them the room to define it as such and begin running to the army. And so they most certainly knew about the Emancipation Proclamation.
It's known as Sherman's March to the Sea. Let's talk about Mr. Sherman for just a second. His attitude towards most things is hard to discern in the sense that it seems that he has what is known, I believe, as Irish Alzheimer's, and that is he forgets everything but his grudges, and he has no. I don't think he could be called an abolitionist warrior. Sure,
no, not even close.
Right, but he also seems like he finds equal disdain in the plantation owners and the plantation system. How did William Tecumseh Sherman command the march as it relates to interaction with the slave refugees?
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I mean, Sherman is someone who is incredibly complicated. He's deeply ambivalent about this issue, and he can be very, well, in some cases, it can be hard to kind of place his position right in his own thoughts on this. And I'll see if I can explain what I mean. In part because Sherman is someone who begins the war not thinking that slavery has anything to do with it. He doesn't see it as being part of why the war's happening. And even as the war begins to evolve into one that embraces emancipation and will become a war to end slavery, he's someone who resists this evolution. He sees it as not necessary. He
It's a
thinks that
distraction.
emancipation, yeah, he thinks it is distraction. He thinks that it's placing political and social issues in the realm of the army, which to him should be geared towards one goal and one goal only, and that's winning the war. And so he'll always say, and he says this clearly in Memphis, that it should be politicians and judges who are setting the course of emancipation. But the reality is that the history is going to unfold in a way that places generals like himself right in the middle of the action. And so that's kind of where he is going to find himself being, as someone who becomes a liberator, but he is a real reluctant liberator. That being said, by 1864, when the march begins, as much as he has resisted emancipation and also resisted black soldiering, another issue that he really disagrees with and tries to fight tooth and nail every step of the way, he is beginning to slowly, and I want to stress slowly, evolve. In fact, this may be being charitable toward him, but he's slowly beginning to recognize that targeting slavery is a way to win the war, that targeting slavery is a war measure and can be very effective for bringing the war to an end. He's also beginning to slowly recognize that at least styling himself as a liberator is good for him politically. He's someone who didn't like politics. He didn't like to play politics, but nonetheless, he began to realize that this styling himself as such, right, was good for him, could be good for him politically and could take the heat off of him. And so when the march unfolds, he is beginning to, as I said, slowly evolve into these two positions. But it is absolutely true too that as the march is unfolding, his main priority is completing the march, doing so in the most easy and efficient way possible, and not having his campaign or his army delayed by the refugees. And so he really places the priority there. And I think the best way we can look and understand maybe some of his perspective is looking at his orders for the campaign. Because as part of his official campaign orders, he includes an order that is kind of like a refugee policy. And what it says is that the army can take enslaved people who run to the army along if these are people who are able-bodied, which for him is a code word meaning basically able to work. Sherman always viewed military labor as being a part of finding refuge with the army, and he always kind of conditioned freedom on labor. But he also says that while that's the case, it's the officer's first duty to see to his own men and to the success of the campaign, knowing that the issue of supplies is a serious one. I paraphrase that, but that's essentially what his order says. And so again, we can see him placing a real priority on supplies, the movement of his army. We can see that's where his priority is. But the reality is that Sherman sets this order. He assumes that his army is going to be able to implement it and that his army and his soldiers are going to be the ones who contain this march. But what's going to become very evident by halfway through the march is that enslaved people are going to run to his army no matter what, that they are also going to have a say-so in what this campaign looks like, whether Sherman likes it or not.
We should note that Sherman, I believe, started the Civil War down in New Orleans, had been posted in the South, and had a sense of Southern life and Southern attitudes.
Yeah, I mean, Sherman was born in Ohio, but for all intents and purposes, he was kind of a Southerner. He had been posted in Florida after West Point. He later spent a significant amount of time in Charleston. He would spend a significant amount of time in St. Louis, which Missouri was a slave state. He had spent a significant amount of time in New Orleans while he was still in the Army. And then he'll go to California for a while, but then when he returns, he bounces around a handful of different positions. But then you're right, he finds himself in Louisiana teaching a college that is the predecessor to today's LSU. And he's there serving as a military superintendent. It's a military school. And he says at one point to his wife that his views on slavery are good enough for this country, country meaning the South. He does all he can to convince his Southern colleagues and friends that he does not have anti-slavery abolitionist views as a way to stay in the South, right? He doesn't want to have to
Mm-hmm.
flee. He doesn't want to be purged or expelled from Louisiana, from his position. And then when the war happens, it becomes very clear to him that he is making war on people who were once previously his friends. And it puts him in real strange situations sometimes. And in fact, when he's at Vicksburg, he meets the mother of a son, the mother of a former student of his, who happens to be in behind the siege lines, right? He talks to her and he has real sympathy for her experience. So Sherman, because of his background in the South and his many years spent living in the South, he had many of the same views as Southerners did. And he was, in some ways, a kind of adopted Southerner, which is all the more ironic considering what happens by the end of the war.
You mentioned politics. Sherman's brother, John, is a senator from Ohio. But the only the thing that I found interesting in your book is when there were so many things I found interesting, but as someone who really enjoys the political history of the Civil War and this entire time period, Stanton makes a visit. Edwin Stanton, who's the Secretary of War. I think he was Attorney General, maybe under Buchanan, but he comes down. He is a radical Republican in slavery, all those sorts of that you would associate with a radical Republican in those days. Stanton and Sherman got along really well at the time. That ended in May or June of 1965. But Stanton comes down to visit Sherman and the Army. What was the purpose of his visit? And what was the reaction of sort of the religious class of leaders that were representing the slaves, the freed slaves?
Sure. Yeah, so Stanton comes, I believe he arrives in Savannah maybe on January 1st, 1865. It's not the first, it might be the second. So it's very early in 1865 in the new year. And ostensibly, he has come down to requisition cotton that has been left in the city and essentially to investigate and inspect and then take control of the cotton that's still there. But it's also very clear, and it becomes very clear to Sherman, that he's also there to launch a mini investigation. And he's there to investigate exactly how Sherman handled emancipation along the path of the march. And one of the reasons that he's here investigating it is because there was a real tragic moment at a place called Ebenezer Creek, in which one of Sherman's subordinates, a man named Jeff C. Davis, not the Confederate president, different person, in which Davis pulled up a set of bridges before the refugees could cross, which led to a Confederate cavalry attack that left enslaved many of the refugees either being captured and re-enslaved or killed on the spot, or it led many of them to drown in the current as they tried to escape. It's a really dark, tragic moment. And word of it gets out. And so by the time Sherman has settled into Savannah, Stanton arrives wanting answers. And as I said, he's there ostensibly to requisition the cotton, but he's also there to begin asking questions about what happened on the march, what happened at Ebenezer Creek, and what happened to the refugees. And Sherman doesn't really give him very many good answers. He tries to have Davis basically speak for himself. But eventually, Stanton will ask for a meeting with 20 of Savannah's Black religious leaders to essentially get their take on the present situation in and around Savannah as it related to the refugees. But in this meeting, he's also going to ask Sherman to leave the room and ask the 20 leaders what they think of Sherman, which is basically a kind of referendum on him and his conduct. And they will all say that they found him to be a gentleman. They celebrate the fact that he is there. So Sherman gets the vote of confidence that he desperately wanted in that moment. But you're absolutely right. I mean, his relationship from this moment on with Stanton will become incredibly fraught, which is all the more interesting because Stanton is very good friends with his brother John. And in fact, they're next door neighbors. So they have a real personal connection through John Sherman. But this will be really the beginning of an unraveling of a personal and professional relationship between William Sherman and Edwin Stanton.
We will discuss that in detail when you come back on the Leaders and Legends podcast to discuss your biography of W.T. Sherman. And I thought I qualify it as an irony. So if you think I'm off base, tell me. When slave owners, slaveholders tried to justify slavery or their treatment of the slaves, one of many excuses they gave was the benefit of Christianity to a group of people who never would have experienced it in Africa. And so therefore the slaveholders have given them Christianity, and that's one of the benefits of being a slave, however you want to say it. But yet the cohesiveness and the intelligence that is attended to being a religious leader gives Christianity an organizational power that helps the freed slaves. Am I saying that in a way that makes sense? Because immediately they went to the religious leaders of Savannah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is something.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, well, this is something that has a deep history, and you're absolutely right. I mean, when we think about the pro-slavery argument in the antebellum period, one significant part of that argument is the argument that you just suggested, right? That plantation owners, Southerners, pro-slavery advocates made this pro-slavery argument on the basis of religion and evangelism. But it's also true that, and historians have done plenty of writing about this, that religion itself becomes one of the real cornerstones of the slave community, and that enslaved people adopt Christianity, and it becomes hugely important to the world they make within American slavery itself. Many of them will read into their own experiences the plight of the Israelites. They'll read into the New Testament the ideas of liberation through Christ, and they'll begin when the Civil War. Well, when the Civil War begins, they will look to the Bible and look to religion as a kind of prism through which they can understand and interpret the political dynamics and the political stakes of what's happening around them. They'll invoke religious language to describe the moment. This is something that is evident if you just read the sources. And as I said, there's been plenty of historians doing really good work on that. And so it's no surprise either that when Stanton arrives in Savannah, he would ask for these religious leaders, in part because pastors in these communities are often folks who are in leadership positions, right? And who have connections with folks. And this becomes a mainstay through Reconstruction as well, right? And so religion absolutely plays a key part in this story. And the point that I just would like to make is that this is something that has real deep history in the antebellum era and has real importance for the history of slavery and the kind of culture and community that enslaved people found within the structure of American slavery.
They encountered a group of leaders, educated men who looked like them.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Absolutely.
That is a very clear answer to a very opaque question. Thank you, Professor Parten, for rescuing me. We are discussing the book Somewhere Toward Freedom, Sherman's March and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation. Our guest is Professor Bennett Parten. I wanted to make sure in the few minutes we have left, Port Royal. Mm-hmm. It figures prominently in your book. I had no clue about any of it. It's maybe a microcosm of the years 1865 to 1876 when Reconstruction, I guess, ends. But tell us about why you chose to focus on that experiment, if that's the right term. Mm-hmm. And is it a metaphor for the larger tragic failings of Reconstruction?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly one way to look at it. And the original book on the subject, in fact, made that same argument. It's called The Rehearsal for Reconstruction, the Port Royal Experiment. And it looked at Port Royal as being a kind of preview for Reconstruction and what Reconstruction would look like at the national level. And what Port Royal is, or what the Port Royal Experiment was a federal initiative launched in the spring of 1862. And it's launched because earlier that fall, or the fall of 1861, the U.S. Navy sails into Port Royal Sound, which is on the South Carolina Sea Islands. And they sail into Port Royal Sound and seize it because it is the largest deepwater port on the southern coastline. And so the Navy wants to use it as a base of operations to blockade both Savannah and Charleston. But when they sail into the port, they fire on the two forts on either end. They take the port. This forces the region's white planters to take flight. And when they do, they leave behind about 10,000 enslaved people. And for all intents and purposes, these people are free. Their masters are gone, right? These are, in a de facto sense, free people. The problem is that's not quite how the U.S. government saw them. This is still 1861. This is a long way until the Emancipation Proclamation. It's a long way until the Second Confiscation Act in the summer of 1862, even. And nonetheless, Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, a man named Salmon Chase, who was a real abolitionist, he envisions a plan, along with a man named Edward Pierce, by which scores of philanthropists, humanitarians, school teachers, pastors, plantation technocrats will come from northern cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, come to the islands, administer aid, build schools, hold classroom sessions, teach schools, build churches, hold religious services. But also, and this is the critical but in the entire story, they will also coerce or convince enslaved people to go back to work in cotton fields, not as slave laborers, but as free laborers working for a wage. And so in this early moment in the war, in early 1862, the Port Royal experiment is meant to be an experiment that begins to start the transition from slavery to freedom. And Chase envisions it as something that could potentially put pressure on the U.S. government to begin embracing emancipation more broadly. And so it is an experiment that has many, many limitations, but it's also a hugely important experiment and initiative to think about when we think about the history of emancipation and how it unfolds in the Civil War. It matters for our story because when Sherman arrives in the coast, he begins the process of sending the refugees who follow him to Savannah down the Ogeechee River, which is really the main waterway for him to access the Atlantic Ocean. He sends them down the Ogeechee, out into the Atlantic, up the coast of Port Royal, and begins integrating the refugees into the Port Royal experiment. And Sherman thinks that this is a smart move because he thinks that there is an infrastructure there to support the refugees. But he also wants to simply rid his lines of the refugees so that he could then make his march through the Carolinas unencumbered. So this is both a matter of self-interest, or this is really a matter of self-interest for him. But it matters for the refugees and for the Port Royal experiment because the arrival of so many refugees is going to destabilize the entire project. They'll almost double the amount of refugees that are there. Pretty soon, too, Sherman's right wing will arrive on the islands, which only adds more people to a pretty small area to begin with. There's going to be a lack of resources, a lack of housing. There'll eventually be a lack of food. And then pretty soon, too, diseases are going to start spreading amongst the refugees who are forced to live in what are essentially refugee camps in really unsuitable and unsustainable conditions. And so pretty soon, Port Royal will become the epicenter of a sprawling refugee crisis that takes or spreads across many of the islands there in South Carolina and Georgia.
There are people involved. I mean, your point's well taken. Sherman just doesn't want distractions. Like this isn't why I have stars on my collar. It's these other reasons. But there were people who both actively tried to help and who actively didn't give a damn, malevolently as opposed to sort of benevolently. How did all of these groups coexist in this small area?
Well, they did, but it wasn't pretty, and it often led to moments of real violence. I mean, that's one of the things we have to consider is that on top of the 10,000 enslaved people who were there originally, there are about 17,000 refugees that arrive. There's Howard's right wing that marches through, which is maybe 30,000 men. There's also already a troop presence, a naval presence, and then all of the northern agents and philanthropists, right? And so in this very small space, there is a real crush of humanity that are all trying to find a way to exist there on the islands. And there were people who were there to look out for the freed people in their best interests. Folks like Rufus Saxon, who was the military governor of the islands and who was a consistent ally to the freed people. But in many cases, the soldiers, the naval officers who were already there, saw this being the Port Royal experiment as being a real kind of side project, as not really being central to the war effort. And I think they resented the kind of aid that many of the freed people received. And there were moments of violence. And moments of violence were also kicked off by the fact that recruiting agents were always trying to recruit freed people for the army, and oftentimes they used coercive measures to do so. So this is a fraught moment, to say the least.
When does Sherman leave to continue his march north, and what happens at that point?
So he leaves Savannah to march through Carolinas in late January of 1865. And what happens at that point is that the army leaves, which places control of Port Royal and much of the area there in the hands of Rufus Saxon, who's the military governor. And this is when the refugee crisis really begins, because as the army leaves, much of the help that the army can provide goes away. Some of the rations, the food goes away. Some of the ability to transport goods and supplies goes away. And so it really isolates Port Royal even further.
That was a great point in your book, that supplies, that you're not feeding a 60,000 man white army. That's leaving.
Exactly. Yeah. And then two, these transports of refugees from Georgia, South Carolina really end because the army places its priority elsewhere. And so there are some refugees who are left stranded in Georgia there along the Ogeechee, which leads to real problems for them as well. And so when Sherman leaves, it really kind of destabilizes things. And so one of the things I really want to do in the book was, while it's very common for histories of Sherman's march to follow the army on through the Carolinas, right, up into North Carolina, and eventually to the Grand Review in Washington, D.C., I really wanted to focus attention on the kind of the world that the army left behind and what it meant for places like my home here in Savannah and some of those islands on the coast that I've visited quite a few times and knew so well from my childhood.
And you do, may I say, a terrific job of articulating that. And to be candid, whether it was, the general who marched to hell or some of the other books that I've read on Sherman's exploits, really starting from September of 64 through the Grand Review in the summer of 65, I didn't give it 2 seconds of thought, because I'm reading about the army and the army's gone. So I'm not paying any attention to what happened. One last question before we ask you the 5 questions that we ask all our guests. You've got politicians, generals, refugees, soldiers. If you could sit down and talk to a group of 5, which group would you choose?
Oh, well, I think, you mean 5 individuals from one single group? Yeah, yeah.
Yes, sir.
I think it'd be amazing to talk to some of the refugees and sort of get their perspective on things. I mean, the reality is that it is hard sometimes to look through the source collection and really see their political ambitions and political aims. And one of the things I want to do in writing this book was highlighting the kind of visions they had for a post-war future. This is something that you can't find a whole lot of, but we can glean it in bits and pieces here. But I would love to have been able to sit down and had a fuller picture, right, and more of an in-depth sort of perspective, right, on the kind of political ambitions that they might have had in making this journey.
A dream passed down through generations that comes true. There's so few other examples of it in American history for sure, but world history as well. We've reached the point on the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Professor, are you ready?
Sure, I think so, at least.
This won't be Stanton talking to the ministers, I promise.
Okay.
What was your first job?
I was the bookkeeper and scorekeeper at my local rec department.
What was your first concert?
Dave Matthews Band, Lakewood Amphitheater in Atlanta, Georgia.
Everybody comes to Atlanta. If you could recommend any book for someone to read, Which book would you choose?
Oh, wow. Wow.
You may want to say Frederick Douglass by David
Uh,
Blight.
yeah, that's true. I give my advisor a shout out. I'm going to go a little off the wall here, but there's a book called The Metaphysical Club by Louis Menand that is a book about ideas in the 19th century. And I think it speaks to why the Civil War was so important. And it illustrates the kind of intellectual transformation that takes place from the beginning of the 19th century to the end of the 19th century. And it explains why so much of the early 20th century, at least in the US, looked the way that it did. And it traces this deep history of optimism, pessimism, thought, right? And I think it's a really insightful book. And Louis Mann, he writes for the New Yorker. He's a wonderful writer and wonderful historian. And I certainly learned a ton in reading it, and it really stuck with me. And so, gun to my head here on a podcast, that's one book that keeps coming to my mind. But I'm sure that there are others that I would recommend as well.
If you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Oh man, well, you want it to be one where you're safe. That's a great question. I don't know, maybe Lincoln to Gettysburg, right? To have been there to hear everything in person, audibly. If you're close enough to hear. There were no microphones, so you had to be close enough to hear everything.
And you couldn't have gone to the bathroom because you'd have missed the whole thing.
That's right. That's right.
That's a very popular answer, by the way.
Yeah, I bet so. Yeah.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record, just to chat about anything you want, whom would be your dinner companion?
Wow,
Who would be your dinner companion?
that's another really really great question. The living part of this is the hard part, because I ask a similar question to my students as a kind of an icebreaker. And I always say that my answer would have been Anthony Bourdain, which of course, unfortunately, he's no longer with us. But he's usually my answer for all those types of questions. But the caveat of being still alive is really difficult. And so in that case, maybe I'll kind of also have a cop out here, and I would say maybe Kirby Smart. He's the coach of the Georgia
Yeah.
Bulldogs, my alma mater. I'm a huge Georgia fan. I grew up outside about 20 miles north of Athens. And Kirby himself is also a Georgian. He's a Georgia alum. And I'd love to just sit around and talk with him and, have a drink with him and get his thoughts on things.
He's a phenomenal coach, a great interview. And I guess I'm thrilled that the background I have for my Zoom calls obscures all of my Notre Dame memorabilia.
Oh, is that right? Okay. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I don't like to reveal how big of a Georgia fan I am, but like I said, I grew up right outside of Athens, went to UGA, and Kirby is also a Bulldog. He's an alumni. He's also a Georgian, and so I think it could be a fun conversation.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, Professor Bennett Parten, author of Somewhere Toward Freedom, Sherman's March and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation. Professor, I don't know how many books I've read on the Civil War. It's well more than 100, maybe even close to 200. Very few that I've accepted when I didn't know what the hell I was talking about. And when it came to the stuff that you were writing about in your book, it was new, it was fresh. It swept away my ignorance of a time period that's both very joyous but interminably sad. And I thank you very much, not only for writing the book, but being on the podcast today.
Oh, well, I appreciate you having me, and hopefully we can do it again sometime.
And I think we'll be able to, because of the marvelous generosity of Rebecca Rosenberg, who is so awesome, who's a publicist at Simon and Schuster, and she sends people my way. Rebecca, if you're listening to this, I guarantee you Bennett's really excited to have met you. But
Oh, absolutely.
I'm very grateful to have you in my life, even if it's just through this podcast. So thank you. Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.